we shouldn't be surprised with all that's coming out and all the worries about tariffs. It's not just that, it's the complexity of everything else as well. The changes within the federal government, the worries about job losses, the worries about a slowing economy, higher inflation, and eventually you get these...
Imagine this, the largest ports in the US suddenly empty. Containers that were supposed to arrive from China simply don't show up. Factories in California, Texas, and Illinois come to a standstill. Warehouses empty out. In just 10 days, the US economy loses more than $10 billion, 0 cents, in shipments. Something has gone wrong. And it doesn't look like just another round of tariff wars. This is a whole new level of economic escalation, one that no one was prepared for, not even the White House.
In other words, pre-substitution, if we just continue as we are now. But of course, people will start to substitute. They will find other goods. And as the Christmas Tree Association said a moment or two ago, it's going to be very difficult to find substitution of many things that we currently get from China.
It all started when Chinese ships suddenly began to deviate from their schedules en masse. Some of them have been idle in Chinese ports for weeks, while others cannot obtain permission to leave. The reason? No sanctions, no official statements, only internal procedures and technical delays. But sources claim that this is a planned move by Beijing, a game of nerves. China is cutting off logistics, the very heart of global trade, at the most sensitive moment.
There are surveys like the Michigan survey, consumer sentiment, and it's a really worrying number because at some point these sentiment surveys feed into hard data of real consumer spending. And we know this from history and precedent, that's what happens. So when we see a number as bad as this one, it is only a matter of time, unless anything else changes that would suddenly make people more cheerful. Look at that chart. I mean, just look at it. Unless people suddenly become more cheerful, why would this not translate into spending? You see, that consumer lab, the lab from Yale, that number of 4,700, that is providing you don't start substituting goods.
President Trump and his team were confident that by raising tariffs and blocking Chinese investments, they were playing a tough but controlled game. But now, everything has changed. For the first time, China has taken action that hits not the negotiations but the real economy. These are no longer abstract figures in customs reports. These are delayed deliveries of batteries for electric cars, disrupted supplies of spare parts, a shortage of semiconductors, and rising prices for consumer goods.
Yeah, you'll be surprised just how much we get exclusively from China. And Jim, I'm really curious to get your perspective on the White House's handling of this situation. Not so much the tariffs that have been announced, but this reporting that the White House, that officials have made clear to Beijing that they want Xi to ask for a call with Trump.
Is this a random glitch in the system or a carefully planned operation? Why now, and why on such a scale? And most importantly, what will follow? Some analysts are convinced that China is testing the limits. It wants to show that it can control not only exports, but also the flow of global logistics itself. That it can shut down the arteries of global trade at any moment, and without giving a single explanation.
Right now, 145 going up against 125. These are the tariffs between the world's two biggest economies.
And here's another number, 4,700, or about $400 per month. That is how much more money Yale's now estimating, the Yale Budget Lab, that President Trump's tariffs are going to cost average households each year. And with just hours left in trading, the Dow right now.
Meanwhile, tension is growing in the corridors of the White House. Diplomatic channels are not working. U.S. trade representatives admit, "We did not expect such a move." And while officials are avoiding loud statements, behind closed doors, a struggle for an urgent solution is underway. Because if no solution is found in the coming days, the value of blocked cargo will grow from $10 billion, 0 cents, and if China continues to use ports as leverage, the global economy could be on the brink of collapse. In this video, we will analyze how exactly China dealt a logistical blow to the US, why the Trump administration was caught off guard, and where all this could lead. Because behind every number is a whole system. And when the system collapses, everyone feels it.
Up. You're seeing that swing here going into the afternoon, up almost 650 points. But it was up and down there throughout earlier in the day. With us now, we have CNN business editor-at-large Richard Quest. We have CNN chief national security analyst Jim Sciutto as well. Richard, a key economic gauge, the consumer sentiment now at its second lowest level on record, going back to 1952. Why?
In mid-September 2025, the scene observed by American port operators was alarming. Giant container terminals from Los Angeles to Savannah were empty. Instead of the usual clatter of cranes and a continuous stream of trucks across the territory, there was silence. These scenes, which began to appear en masse on social media and in the specialized media, were the first visible symptom that the logistics system between China and the US had cracked. However, as it turned out later, this was not a technical glitch or a seasonal slowdown, but the result of a planned and lightning-fast economic maneuver that left the White House in a state of confusion.
Well, if they did fall on deaf ears, but it's just the latest example in the really day by day, the deepening trade war that is underway between the United States and China. Yes, we are learning that U.S. officials privately behind the scenes urged China to not retaliate. In fact, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been saying that publicly all along, warning countries to not retaliate. Well, those warnings have fallen on deaf ears, particularly with China, as they raised their tariffs to 125%. The question now is which side is going to blink?
Within 10 days of the crisis, the volume of Chinese cargo that failed to enter the country reached more than $10 billion, 0 cents. These were not abstract figures. The delays affected specific supply chains, from components for electric vehicles to medicines, without which entire clinics risked being shut down. According to the American Association of Commercial Carriers, in the port of Oakland alone, 73 container ships were idle for the first 3 days, most of which had permission to unload but had not received confirmation of arrival from Chinese ports. At the same time, there was not a single official statement from the Chinese authorities in the media, only cautious hints about internal port system overload and ongoing health checks that allegedly required additional days to process each ship's departure. This silence was perhaps the most frightening thing. The Trump administration, despite its ostensible confidence in its economic tools, was unable to respond immediately. Behind the scenes, emergency meetings were held with representatives of logistics corporations, suppliers of critical goods, and major manufacturers, who began to report empty warehouses within a few days. One manager at Navitec Components, which supplies assembly lines in Detroit, told reporters that 2 more days without supplies and microchip production will be halted for at least 2 weeks. Tesla, Rivian, General Motors all found themselves in the same boat and in the same vulnerable position. But what looked like an unfortunate coincidence or a one-off glitch turned out to be a carefully thought-out scheme. China did not formally close its ports. There was not a single decree or notification to the International Maritime Organization. But the actions taken at the logistics level proved more destructive than any declaration. According to leaks from commercial structures, Chinese maritime authorities introduced internal restrictions on the processing of applications for ships bound for the US, double confirmation of loading, mandatory repeat sanitary checks, and, most importantly, artificially prolonged processing of export documentation were allegedly required.
Lived in China. You've covered China for some time now. As we're looking at this question of who's going to blink first, with 2 very different political systems, what is your gauge on this?
Well, different systems, listen, one's a democracy, one is not. One's a single-party state, very much not a democracy. But China does have politics, and Chinese leaders do not want to be seen, we were talking about this yesterday, I believe, do not want to be seen as capitulating to America. That is not good politics for a Chinese leader.
While striking fact was that even under such blatant pressure, China did not say a word about it. This silence is a real threat, as it deprives the US of the opportunity to negotiate in the usual diplomatic arena. Who can you negotiate with if officially nothing is happening? According to sources in the US Trade Representative's office, it was precisely this aspect that caused internal panic. After all, when there is no reason to make accusations, there is no reason to demand cancellation.
Including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, of course, I'm going to respond. And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs. ABC's chief White House correspondent Mary Bruce leading us off.
Today, President Trump side by side in the Oval Office with the head of the Irish government.
In this way, China has shown that it is capable of striking at economic arteries while remaining within acceptable limits. Its logistics infrastructure is the largest in the world, and its share of global freight transport, including control over supply chains for lithium, rare earth metals, and components for high-tech goods, is so large that the slightest slowdown is enough to paralyze markets. American analysts have called this the 200 km/h flat tire effect. Everything goes according to plan until it suddenly starts to fall apart. And the main thing is that no one knows where the limit is. Caught in a trap of its own trade expectations, the Trump administration found itself in a situation where the usual tools, new tariffs, threats, or asset freezes, had no effect. There were still no goods. They simply weren't being shipped. Formally, this was done according to regulations. Unofficially, it was in response to US actions. It was a logistical chess game in which China made the first move and did so at a moment when the US had not even had time to set up its pieces.
But it's also an opening to say, okay, we're capping this for now, and that perhaps offers a way forward that we could begin talking about how to bring these down.
While Washington was trying to understand the nature of the unexpected transport blockade, American businesses began to feel not the consequences, but direct losses. The delivery delays, reported in the early days, began to turn into a threat of production stoppages. This had a particularly severe impact on sectors where dependence on Chinese components cannot be replaced, even in the medium term. The first to feel the pinch were electronics manufacturers and car companies focused on electric transport. Delays in the delivery of lithium-ion batteries, control chips, and individual components caused huge disruptions to production schedules. According to internal documents from one of the largest automotive companies, which had planned to launch a new line of electric vehicles in June 2025, each day of downtime resulted in losses of more than $12 million, 0 cents. At the time of writing, production had already been halted for 5 days, and there were no alternatives to supplies from China. Officially, company representatives spoke of temporary logistical difficulties, but in closed meetings with representatives of the Ministry of Trade, much harsher words were used. One of the directors said that they had become completely dependent on a country that could slam on the brakes at any moment and paralyze us. Against this backdrop, the situation surrounding Tesla attracted particular attention. With growing demand for electric vehicles and the US's participation in the Global Green Transition Program, Tesla was supposed to become a symbol of American technological superiority. However, the Austin plant faced a shortage of battery modules supplied from the Shanghai plant. Although Tesla representatives claimed that they were using a mixed logistics model and were able to redirect supplies via South Korea and Japan, insiders reported internal meetings discussing a partial freeze of production lines if supplies were not received by the end of the month.
To allow that. So now you have the US president say, well, I'm not going to open those channels. China has to open them first. It's kind of ridiculous at the end of the day because you are playing with the interests of American consumers, Chinese consumers, etc. The other point I would make about China's reaction today in not quite meeting the U.S. tariffs, 145% U.S., China goes to 125. And in Xi's statement, he says, we're going to 125 in response. That's as high as we're going because this is getting a little ridiculous, right? And that's both a signal to say we're not going to get caught up in this tit for tat to the degree that the president is.
All this paints a disturbing picture in which a trade war is turning into a logistical standoff, where every delay is not just a bureaucratic hiccup, but a political signal. While the White House is looking for a response, China has already made its move. And, by all accounts, the next move is up to the US. The only question is whether they are ready for it. While factories in Detroit were revising their schedules and major distributors were trying to keep supply chains from breaking down completely, an equally intense wave of political, economic, and social reactions erupted within the US. From Capitol Hill to cable news studios, a debate began in which the conflict with China was no longer seen as a purely foreign economic issue. It had become a domestic crisis. The opposition accused the administration of strategic blindness. Republican lobbyists pressured Congress to take immediate countermeasures, and large corporations, publicly or behind the scenes, claimed that they had been caught in a trap of political ambitions. The refrain, "We cannot build logistics on emotions," was heard more and more often.
The higher the tariff, the more likely it is to have them come into the
higher the tariff, the more you're going to put on the value of that piece, those goods, the higher people are going to pay in shops.
In particular, California Senator Elaine Marshall, who heads the Committee on Industry Policy, said in an urgent statement that our technological revolution could be derailed in a week if the supply of critical components is not restored. And although official government reports remained cautious, reports from the business community left no doubt that this was not a temporary incident, but a crisis of management. In a document obtained by the New York Standard, one of the managers of a logistics center in New Jersey wrote bluntly, "We no longer know who to believe, our customers who assure us that the cargo has been shipped, or the officials who say that the ship has not cleared customs in China."
They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
Public rhetoric also became more heated. Talk shows, newspaper columns, and social media platforms discussed everything from the US's dependence on Chinese raw materials to the alleged betrayal of national interests by companies that, according to some, handed over the entire supply chain to a potential enemy. Viral videos filmed against the backdrop of empty warehouses of large distributors began to garner millions of views. One of them, recorded by a former employee of an electrical components factory in Arizona, where a 2-week shutdown was suddenly imposed, ended with the words, "If you want American industry to get back on its feet, stop depending on those who keep us on a leash." The video made it into the evening news, after which a wave of demands arose for the government to take immediate measures to break with China.
Well, when you look at the kind of input Musk has been having into politics, there has been some polling done which suggests there is a strong dissatisfaction with.
A split began within the Republican camp. Some, such as former Foreign Policy Advisor Stephen Rosenthal, proposed tougher tariffs, expanding the sanctions list, blocking Chinese investment in American companies, and imposing quotas on Chinese goods. Others, more pragmatic, including representatives of the agricultural sector and pharmaceutical corporations, called for caution, pointing out that without access to Chinese raw materials, US exports would also be threatened. One representative of the Midwestern Export Coalition put it bluntly, "You want to hit Beijing? Fine. But first explain how our own tractors will run if we lose spare parts from Guangzhou." The unpredictability of the situation was reinforced by the lack of clear signals from China. No representative of the PRC offered an open explanation of what was happening. Everything was based on speculation, leaks, and indirect signs. And this silence was more effective than any statement. It paralyzed even those companies that were not directly affected. Fearing they would be next, they began to review contracts, postpone deals, and change supply chains. A domino effect was created, and amid the chaos, there was a growing sense that the situation was spiraling out of control. In this situation, the White House seemed to be trapped. Any sudden move could exacerbate an already precarious situation. Nevertheless, a special group was urgently convened under the National Security Council, which included representatives of the Department of Commerce, the Pentagon, the State Department, and major industrial unions. Both economic and military options for exerting pressure were discussed at closed-door briefings. One proposal was to temporarily restrict Chinese ships from entering East Coast ports, not as a retaliatory measure, but as a precautionary safety check. According to the Capital Chronicle, this proposal was met with fierce opposition from a number of coastal state governors who feared a collapse in cargo traffic and protests from port workers' unions. Meanwhile, public sentiment turned into political pressure. Against a backdrop of electronics shortages and rumors of medicine delays, the administration's approval rating dropped by 7 points for the first time in many months. During prime time on CNN and Fox News, there was discussion about whether Trump had lost his own trade game. Journalists wrote about a logistical disaster, an invisible blockade, and a moment of truth for the White House. Major American business associations issued a joint statement emphasizing that the stability of trade flows must be a priority, regardless of diplomatic disputes. This was a loud signal. Corporate America was tired of playing the sanctions game and wanted a way out of the crisis.
The Chinese impression is that they are willing to at least negotiate, not necessarily on Donald Trump's terms, but to talk. But their impression is that the U.S. has not opened channels and not made an effort to open up channels.
By this point, Washington already understood that the trade war had reached a new level. It had become a struggle not over tariffs, but over control of systems, for the right to determine who gets access to critical resources and how. And although the temporary easing of pressure may have softened the blow, no one was under any illusions. This was only the beginning of a long, protracted, and very dangerous battle in which the stakes would only grow.